In this video for the KCAD Digital Art and Design Augmented Reality Framework, I'm going to go over the web app setup process and how to customize it. So what makes an application register as a web app or progressive web app is some of the files that are put in the directory on the server that will be recognized by modern browsers and devices as having app-specific properties according to certain standards. These standards are continuously shuffling between browsers as they're adding new functionality and new support. This has been a growing standard since around 2016 or 2017. It continues to get more and more support. If we look at the web folder inside of here, now we went through all of these files in an earlier video, but I'm going to specifically point out what's necessary for us to change in order to brand your specific project. So there's three main areas that we'll be covering, and that's making changes to the icons, the splash screens, and the manifest files. So let's go ahead and start out with the graphical elements of the icons. If we go into the icon folder, there are all these icon sizes that we've went through before. And what I typically like to do is, when I'm going to make a new icon and replace all of these, is I'll open these two largest ones, the 512 and the 512 maskable, and I'll open these with Photoshop. And then inside of Photoshop, I'll go ahead and use these two as my templates to create a new icon. So this one has the rounded corners we'll need. This maskable one has the square corners, and I'll set up my new icon, whatever it's going to be, save over these two images, and then I'll go ahead and look at the next size, 384, and I'll just use image size inside of Photoshop and change the size to the next size down, 384, and then I'll save using File, Export, Export As. I'll check whether it has a transparency or not, whether it's a maskable or not, and sometimes I'll use the smaller file 8-bit, which can help bring the file size down even more. You can play with those two features, but ultimately I'll export this as a PNG, and then I would save it over the next size down, and I'll do that with each of the regular and maskable icons all the way down. Now you could probably set up an action inside of Photoshop with a batch action that could do all of those sizes for you if you ended up doing a lot of icon creating. So once you get through all of the individual icons in the icon folder, then you can move on to the favicons. These are more traditionally used instead of by kind of app-specific launch screens and install prompts and things. These are more used by the browsers to show a tiny icon in the browser tab. So we have three sizes you can create in the exact same way as the other icons, which is just to save over these names with these sizes, 96 by 96, 32 by 32, and 16 by 16. The only one that you really have to worry about doing a different process is the favicon ICO, which is kind of the original favicon for browsers. And we just need to use a web tool for this. We can go over back in our browser and go to favicon.ico. And in favicon.ico, we can use this automatic web tool. I have a PNG will turn into a favicon. We can also use text or an emoji, but in most situations, you'll probably just be using one of the icons you've already created. So I'll click on PNG, and then I can go ahead and let's use the actual largest icon. Let's do the 512 maskable, or let's use the 512 with rounded corners. That'll look nice. And can drag that in there and go ahead and download it. It will download this zip file. Now there will be other icons in here, some other sizes. In fact, you could even use, if you wanted to copy also the Apple Touch icon, we'll get to that in a moment, but this generates a regular favicon.ico that we can use and add into our application. So copy it from here and go back into the web folder here and copy it right there. So get rid of these for now to clean up my downloads folder. So once we have replaced all of the icons in the icon folder and replaced all the favicons with our new icon at all the correct sizes, the final place that we had just mentioned that we don't want to forget about is inside of images is the Apple Touch icon. And this is 180 by 180. So you can size this. You can either grab it from the favicon pack or you can size it yourself using Photoshop with the rounded corner icon, and that's what will show up on an iOS home screen. The other images inside of this folder are automatically generated from Animate, and we don't need to worry about customizing those as far as the web app goes. That would happen when you publish after you've customized your splash screen in Animate. So that does it for all of the icons and favicons, and now we can move on to the next part, which is splash screens. So there's only one spot where we have to worry about the splash screens, and that's in the splash folder, and there are 32 of them. These are all for Apple and iOS. On Android, a splash screen automatically gets generated by an icon and a color and the title from your manifest file. We'll go over that in a moment. So the Android splash screens are kind of auto-generated, and the iOS splash screens require a specific size for both portrait and landscape for each device. So that's why there's 32 different sizes, and they all have very different aspect ratios, and they all just match the size of all of the different iOS devices, all of the phones and tablets. There isn't really a special way to deal with these. I typically start with one of the largest ones. You can kind of go through the list and look at the sizes, and I get a large one, make sure that I have a large version of what I want to make the splash screen. In this case, I just have the icon centered in the splash screen, which makes it pretty easy. And I just open all 32 of these images in Photoshop, and once I generate the first larger one, I copy that and then just paste it into each of the other versions, nudge it and move it around or scale it appropriately. And then I go ahead and save over it using the same PNG method with the export for web there. So there's really, again, no special way to handle the splash screens for iOS. This is what shows up when you tap the icon on the home screen and it loads the application. The splash screen should show right away before the application shows up. So those are the two graphical elements, the icons and the splash screens. And then finally, we have the manifest file. So here we have, also in the root of our web folder here, we have our manifest.json. This stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and is typically just read as JSON. So manifest.json or JSON. And we'll take this file, and I'm going to go ahead and, oops, I didn't mean to double click it. I'm going to open it with, let's right click and open with my Visual Studio Code here and open it up. And most of the text in here, the code in here, is just telling it where the icons are and what sizes they are, and what their purpose is, and you don't have to touch any of that. As long as you replace all the icons that are already in the folders where I just showed you, then these will all line up and work great. So up here we just have a couple little things that we can change that will kind of register or be properties of our application. So the first one is the name of the application. This might show up in an install prompt screen. So instead of KCAD AR framework, maybe you want to call it my cool AR project. And then the short name, now this is what will show up underneath the icon on an Android device or a Windows device or something like that. So you want to make sure this is nice and short so it doesn't get cut off. So maybe we'll just call this cool AR like that. You can maybe go with or without a space there and see if there's enough room. But we'll leave it like that for now. And then we can leave the language, and we can leave the start URL. That just tells it where to actually launch the application from, and that index file in the root, which will launch our splash screen we made it animate. The display full screen, you can leave that in place. You may want to change the background color or the theme color. These are both set to white right now, but depending on how you have your splash screen, you may want to change it to match. And then the orientation, you can leave that as well, because we want this to be able to be used in landscape and portrait. So we can really just make these 2, possibly 4 changes. Definitely change the name and the short name, and then if you want a different background color and theme color, the theme color may show up in various places, like as the edge of a window or something once it pulls away from a browser, or it might be part of the icon highlight on different devices or things like that. So now I'll go back to the file list here, and the only other file that has to do with the web app setup is this service worker, which I'll open very quickly just for a moment. I'll open this also here in VS Code. And a service worker, there is a very big part of web applications and web apps and progressive web apps, and there's a lot to be learned about how a service worker works, what it can be used for. It actually works as like an interim between the front-end JavaScript and the back-end server code. We have a nice template set up here, which is going to handle all of our file cache. It's going to pre-cache some elements. It's going to delete old caches when we need to. It's going to automatically handle cache, which is going to make things run faster and even make the splash screen element work offline and things like that. But specifically, it needs to be in here in order to register as a progressive web app in certain browsers like Chrome. And what I'll get into in the final video is how to actually update this. There's a spot where we want to update the version number to help queue the users for an update once we actually get it online if we make any changes. So I'll go ahead and close this for now, and I'm going to go back into the browser, because the last thing I want to show you in this video, go back to our framework, is there is a cool way that Chrome has to actually check and make sure that you have all of the things that it requires to be a progressive web app in place. Kind of goes through this little checklist of your app and shows you whether you have everything you need, which should be good to go from the onset using the framework here. So what we can do is right click and choose inspect, and that will open up the developer console here where we can see the underlying HTML and CSS. And there's a tab here if we go over and click on Lighthouse. Okay, this is a tool that can generate a Lighthouse report which checks to see if this is a progressive web app. So we'll just leave the defaults, the mode, navigation, we'll leave that the default. Device is set to mobile. You can check to see if it has everything it needs to be a progressive web app on desktop and mobile, but we might as well stick with mobile as a default since that's how our app is going to be used primarily. We'll leave all of these categories checked. In fact, I'll drag this window up a little so we can see the rest of it. And I'll go ahead and click on Analyze Page Load. And this can take a couple of minutes. As you can see, it created like an iOS emulator here within the browser, loaded the app up, and just like that, it gave us our, drag this up so we can see the rest of it, it gave us our statistics. So it didn't know about the performance, but we can see that, so there's nothing about the performance. We got an initial kind of 3/4 Q on accessibility, but 100 on best practices, 91 on SEO, and most specifically what we're looking for is a green check mark for PWA, which stands for Progressive Web Apps. So we can go down here and look at some of the details, the metrics. Let's see, diagnostics. So that's all of the initial performance that we could go through, accessibility it's going through. But here, regarding the PWA, this is really the part that I wanted to show you, is we have everything in there, the manifest and the icons, which make it installable, and all these other things that it wants to register a service worker like I just talked about. It's configured for splash screens. We set a theme color for the address bar. It can see that content is sized correctly for the viewport because of the automatic resizing we set in there. It has certain meta tags in there to account for mobile devices and applications, provides the Apple Touch icon, and also has a manifest with maskable icons. And that lets the browser know that you should prompt, whether you're on a device or a desktop, that you should prompt to, do you want to install or do you want to open with, since I already have this one installed. So once you set up the icons and the splash screens and the manifest file, then you should be good to go with your rebranded web app. And the final step, which we'll get into in the last video, is to actually upload these files to a web server so that you can access them online and use your application and send anyone else to the URL for them to use it as well on their own device.